Hello, watch enthusiasts. Now, today I'd like to talk about a watch which I bought a while back and reviewed, and I had a great deal of mixed comments about this watch because it is a very high-end Rolex Submariner homage, and this is the Ginault Ocean Rover. Now, many people on YouTube have reviewed the Ocean Rover, and the general consensus has been that it's a superb quality watch for the price, despite the fact that it is an homage to the Rolex Submariner. And today I've been approached by the brand again to have a look at two new models of this watch, which I've owned for a few months now and I've enjoyed a great deal. And these new versions have a date version over here, you see, and this is available with both that blue bezel and the black bezel if you prefer. Or indeed this version, which hasn't actually been released to the public and is one which I'm pleased to be presenting to you, which is a version with BGW9 Lume, which is a very real change from the original coloured Lume. But I'll get onto that in just a moment. Before that, I would like to talk about the watch and the brand, because I haven't been paid to review these watches at all. I was simply offered to review them because, as you know me from having owned having bought a previous Ocean Rover and produced a review. And I must say I was quite interested to have a look at these watches because I was very impressed by the original due to the fact that it offers really quality that I wouldn't expect to see at this price point from a new brand. And really, Ginault are a brand that produce watches that are, as I've said, homages, and as a result do get a great deal of flack because of the fact that there are a great deal of people who simply aren't happy with spending over $1,000 on an homage watch, and I can certainly understand that. It really is understandable when a Rolex Submariner is only a few thousand more than that, so one may say that one should simply save up. But the reason why I found this watch so interesting is it allows you to access a watch which is really unattainable for most watch lovers out there, and myself included, the Rolex Milsub. And of course, the Rolex Milsub is a watch which it was produced in the second half of the last century, in the 60s and 70s, in different iterations and versions for the British Navy, the Royal Navy. And this was a version of the Submariner which adhered to their specifications of having sword hands with more lume and fixed spring bars. In this case, this doesn't have these, which I think is really quite helpful because it means you can change the straps. But this look of that military Submariner has really been lost, I suppose, in the more modern Rolex Submariners. And so as a result, these Milsubs are worth near £100,000 each. And that's where I think this watch comes in as a really nice alternative, which offers fantastic quality and build quality, and is produced by people who clearly have a real love for the vintage Rolex and the simple and elegant aesthetics that this dive watch has had, and have produced a very compelling package, which offers the quality that, frankly, I would expect from a €3,000 or $3,000 Swiss watch. So I'll first talk about my watch, and the one which I've owned for a few months now and which I've enjoyed immensely. And this is the standard version. And this has, though I will go more heavily into details with the BGW9 version, simply because it has the bracelet, so I can show you that as well. Whereas mine I've been wearing on a NATO strap to give it that more military aesthetic, but that's just a matter of preference. But in terms of the features this watch originally had, well, it had a beautiful enamel dial, which I'll show, as I've said, in more detail with the other versions, and also just a generally splendid build quality. So, for instance, we have the most fantastic of finishing on the hands, which feature a very smooth curve over the top of the hand, with a mirror finish, which really is beyond what I've seen at this price point before. Similarly, one has fantastic quality from the bezel, which has the most fantastic mechanism I've come across, I must say, where it pushes in and turns. And for a diver's bezel specifically, it's a really tremendous setup. And it wouldn't be a great bezel for example, a pilot's watch, but in this instance, for this application, it's an excellent bezel. And actually why this watch is an ISO 6425 diver's watch and is certified as such. Now, in terms of the specifications and details of the watch, before I talk about the newer iterations, the watch has a movement which is made by Ginault and is made almost entirely in the US. And it is a clone of the ETA 2824, but it is chronometer certified by the brand and timed for 6 weeks before sale. You even receive a little leaflet which shows you the timing details of the watch, which I must say I do appreciate, because it does give you an element of inclusion in the testing of the watch, and does give you a certain certification as to the care that's been taken making the watch. And the movement is also guaranteed for 3 years, while the case and rest of the watch is guaranteed for 1 year. So I do appreciate the extra time given to the warranty. And I will admit it's not up there with the 5 years that Christopher Ward, for instance, offer, which is something that I must say I was impressed by, to see Christopher Ward offer this. But I still think it's pretty excellent, frankly, from a new brand like this, to be offering such a brilliant approach to taking care of the watch over time. And really, the brand that Ginault competes with, I feel, the most in terms of ideology, is Mark II, who've gained a great deal of reputation for creating really excellent quality homages to Rolexes from the past. But I must say, having handled the Mark II before, I do feel this offers far more features at a lower price, and frankly, just as good, if not better, build quality. So I was very impressed by this watch for this price point. And the one thing about this no-date configuration of the watch that some people were interested in changing, at least in my comments and emails I've received, was that they weren't keen on the custard colour of the lume, which I personally find to be quite charming, due to the fact that it harks back to old tritium lume. But I can certainly understand why someone would prefer a more simple aesthetic. And as a result, of speculation as to what this would do to sales, and what people would think of it, Ginault have produced this version of the Ocean Rover. And this is a version of the no-date model. And it still is the 300-metre timed and certified ISO diver that the original was. But now it has this BGW9 lume, and I will show you a lume shot of all three of these watches at the end of the video. But BGW9 has a very different look to the golden sand lume used. It has a much more flat look in the light, rather than having the sparkly effect that their golden lume has. This is a much more sedate look, which I think will appeal to a great deal of people. Also, in the dark, rather than glowing a bright green, it glows a crisp ice blue, which I must say looks quite fantastic, and I really do like BGW9 lume for this very reason. But I'd like to talk about the case of the watch and the dimensions first, and talk about the quality that goes into this watch, because I feel that very often homage watches are watches where often corners are cut because people are sold on buying the watch for it to look like a watch they would like to own. But in this case, the quality really is there. And I'll start with the dial of the watch. And the dial of these watches are enamel dials, and you'll see in the various cutscenes I've put in that the gleam from these dials is superb. And very, very few brands are able to make these. Notable examples are Zinn and Seiko that produce watches with these types of dials at this price point. But then they have a much greater workforce and team dedicated to them, which is really why I must say I have a real love for Zinn, for instance, and Seiko indeed. But I'm impressed to see that Ginault have been able to produce a dial like this with such attractive fittings on it. So we have these fixtures, which are these indices, which are applied indices, which are again beautifully polished, just like the hands, and filled very clearly with that BGW9 lume. In terms of longevity of the lume, I've found that this will last about 11 to 12 hours, which is about equivalent to the previous lume seen on the other models on the market. So it certainly does show the aspects of the watch that haven't changed, but have changed as more of an aspect which is down to opinion. Now, the hands are one of those parts of the watch which I find are often neglected by a lot of brands, and this is why I love certain watches by, for instance, brands like Tudor, where they've really taken care to polish the hands beautifully. And the same is the case here. So the hands are, if I can just show you, they have a domed polish which reaches its apex in the centre of the hand and then curves back down to form a sword shape to the hand, and is an element of care which I really wouldn't see normally at this price point. And of course they have a full mirror finish, and the second hand is again painted red to make it a little bit more legible on the dial. Also, the centre of the second hand is left blank, which I think is a nice touch, which means there is a little bit of uniformity to that central section of the hand. And I'll just move the hands, and while doing so, I'll show you the crown, which is this really very beautifully decorated crown with the brand's flower logo on its tip, which is excellently made and has a very, very smooth action to the movement of it. And I'll talk about the movement in more detail in a moment once I've talked about the case. But as you can see, it unscrews from the case because this watch is a 300-meter diver. And of course, one has manual wind and indeed hacking. And if I just move the hands out of the way, the one complaint I would have with the dial of the watch is that I do feel that there's a little bit too much text, which I think is neither here nor there, and that's merely my opinion of this watch. So one has Ginault kinetic continuous, which again I think is somewhat unnecessary, and I can see why they put it there to balance out the text on the bottom half of the dial. But I must say, I think a lot of people would like to see a far more simple and blank dial, but that very much is a matter of opinion. And of course, one has hand built in America, because apart from a few springs, this watch is almost entirely made in the US, and those springs that are required from elsewhere are from Switzerland. So there certainly is no lack of quality here. So I'll just screw the crown back in and show you the rest of the case. Now, the dimensions of the case are much more similar to the 16610 Submariners than to any others. So one has a 40mm diameter from side to side of the watch, and then 13mm from the back of the watch, as you can see, which is quite heavily domed through the top of that rather beautifully boxed sapphire. And that sapphire is another detail where they really have excelled here. We have this beautiful curvature upwards, and then a very soft curvature over the top, which is something that one would normally not see even at this price point. And other brands like Oris, for instance, really make some beautiful crystals. But I must say, in its own way, I do like the way they've pulled off this style. Now, the bezel which sits around it is another element of this watch, which I find very impressive, and is again where the brand have looked to the history of dive watches for information and an idea. So this bezel presses in and then is unidirectional, and it will not move at all, actually. There's no play in it whatsoever otherwise, which is an element which I must say I like. I think for many this is unnecessary, and I can certainly understand that. But I'd rather have a bezel that you push in and then turn than a bezel which is extremely stiff to turn. But that really is my preference and a subjective aspect to it. And the watch also features a painted aluminium insert for the bezel. And painted aluminium is, of course, not as scratch-resistant as ceramic, and there's no way of denying that. It certainly isn't as scratch-resistant as ceramic and will take the scratches and knocks of daily wear. But then Ginault argue that it gives the watch a far more traditional look and is far more in keeping with the aesthetic. And I think I agree. I think that a ceramic bezel may look incongruous with the rest of the case, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And also, of course, an aluminium insert can be exchanged very cheaply, which is certainly a benefit that one doesn't have with ceramic, where a new insert will set you back quite a few £100s on something like a Rolex Submariner, where I've heard reports of a new insert costing £800, which really is an incredible amount of money for something as simple as a bezel insert. Now, moving on to the rest of the case, we have a continuation of this really beautiful polishing, which carries on along the flanks of the watch and is very, very well done, which gives a pure mirror finish, and certainly it can't really be argued with in terms of quality, and which carries on into the bracelet, though I'll talk about that in just a moment. The top of the lugs are brushed in a lateral pattern, so it goes around the case, rather than the straight down brushing that one sees on for instance, Steinhardt homages. So it certainly is nice to see this care taken. And it's an extremely fine brushing, which frankly is comparable to, for instance, the Tudor that I'm wearing today, in terms of how fine the brushing is, which I must say I like to see on a watch. And I think the quality of finishing is often neglected by brands in favour of just a large number of different finishes. Now, this brushing is continued onto the sides of the bezel, or if I can just focus it for you, we have brushing along the edge of this bezel and polishing along the top, which gives a break-up to the form of this watch, and I think makes it look a little bit better on the wrist, and certainly makes it look all the more dressy, rather than looking overtly sporty, which is something that I often have a complaint with, because it does make a watch a little bit less wearable for a lot of people, and many people have told me that actually watches like, for instance, the Zin U1, they've shied away from just because they're a little bit too difficult to dress up, for instance, and I can certainly understand that. Now, moving over to the caseback of the watch, we have a caseback which is very reminiscent of Rolex casebacks. As you can see, it does have the same knurling around the edge for removal, and it describes the specifications as a 300-meter diver, the serial numbers, and also have stainless steel and Ginault. And this is all quite deeply engraved and painted, which I think adds a level of quality to the watch, and then is polished and brushed to add variety. And of course, the movement inside it is a 25 joule ETA 2824 clone made by the brand. But as I've said, it is timed for 6 weeks very extensively, and does also feature particular springs from Switzerland, as well as the rest of the movement being made in the US. So that does show some elements of this movement, and also the fact that various alloys are used only by this brand in the movement, which I think does add value to the watch, and the fact they've actually had to engineer something to make a better movement all round. And this does bring me on to the bracelet, which I feel is a real pièce de résistance on this watch, with these solid end links which are beautifully brushed and finished, leading on to the bracelet, which is again exactly what you would expect from a brand of this nature, and I think matches the quality of the case very well. So we have brushing along the top of the bracelet and very, very sharp edges along here. And by sharp, I don't mean sharp as in sharp in terms of cutting yourself, but rather sharp in terms of giving a very crisp line. And of course, the links are tapered down from 20 millimeters to 16 or 18 if you include the width of the clasp. Now, similarly, one has a really attractive tapering of the thickness of the links, which grow gradually thinner as you go down the bracelet, which adds another degree of quality to this watch, and a degree of quality which is very rarely seen. And of course, a thinning bracelet is something which is a matter of opinion, but I think it adds a certain degree of finesse to this watch, and I certainly do like it. The sides of the links are, again, polished very beautifully, and one can see the screws on the sides of the links too. And along these edges, one has a bevel which runs along the edge of the case, as you can see, a polished bevel, which is very useful, I think, in terms of breaking up the profile of the watch, and is continued down the bracelet. Now, the clasp is very much a remake of the Rolex Glide Lock, which some people will have complaints with, and I can certainly understand that one would want a proprietary clasp just to add a certain variety to the watch. But they really have done an excellent job here, and I can't fault them on that whatsoever. I really must say they've done an excellent job. So we have polishing along these sections. If I just get that into focus for you, we have a very elegant polishing, and then, for instance, we have a bead blasted central section to the elbow joint, which does add quality to the watch and does show they've put attention to detail even into the inside of the workings of the watch, which is something that you wouldn't expect to see. Now, the clasp closes. If I can just focus that for you. I do apologise. My camera's having real troubles focusing today for some reason. But we have this clasp, which, as you can see, is actually on a joint. So rather than wearing down and being opened and closed by friction, we have a very clear sprung section here, which I think does add a great deal of quality to the watch. And I really do appreciate the addition of this to a clasp, which means that over time you won't get the usual wear and play that builds up. And of course, one has a very, very secure safety lock over the top. Now, once that's open, you will notice there is a glide lock system, which is again a very clear remake of the Rolex version, and there isn't any innovation in terms of creating something new here, but they have done a very good job of putting this in, which of course allows one through the ratcheting system to adjust the bracelet by about 2 centimeters along here. As you can see, it slides along and then pops into place, which allows you to adjust it on a hot day, for instance, or indeed for diving. But I found this to be more use, really, than a dive extension, because it's much more variable and much easier to use. So that's certainly something that I do appreciate to see. Now I'll move over to the second version of this watch here, which is the blue and gold bezel version of the Ocean Rover. Now this watch is very much the same in terms of the specifications, still being that ISO 300-meter diver that we've seen, and having the same impeccable build quality. But one change here is that you see the enamel dial actually slopes and falls into the date window, which is fitted to this version with the addition of date next to the kinetic continuous on the dial, which is obviously a remake of the Oyster Perpetual, for instance. But I must say I can understand why it was put there. But what this really does serve to highlight is the quality of the dial finishing and the enamel work on the dial, because very few enamel dials have this very smooth edge. Often the enamel is cut to form the date window, whereas here we have the date window built in, which creates a wonderful effect as the soft soft polished finish of that dial rolls into the window to create a vintage effect to this watch while also retaining that quality finish. And in this case, the date wheel is black with white text, which serves to break it up a little bit. And this is again a matter of preference. I personally am one for matching date wheels to the colour of the dial, but I know that some like a contrasting look, so that is an element of debate here. And one interesting detail, which I think a lot of you may want to talk about in the comments down below, because it certainly is something that I personally didn't think I would like at all, because I don't tend to be a person for gold watches or gold sports watches. But I must say I rather like this blue bezel. It does add a certain difference to this watch, and of course does move away from the mil-sub aspect of this watch quite a great deal, in terms of creating a more luxurious air about this. So that certainly is something to be seen with this bezel. It doesn't sit with that original feeling of the watch, and that is something that will be a problem for some people. But certainly I do find that it breaks up the watch and creates a watch which perhaps will work better on a daily basis. And one feature and detail which isn't visible in pictures, but certainly something I've noticed, is the gold colour of the bezel matches the golden Lume colour on this watch, which makes it look a little bit less incongruous than if you simply put a blue and gold bezel on a normal steel Submariner. And of course the action is just as good in this instance, and really leaves nothing to be desired in terms of functionality. So that's certainly an interesting piece, and one which I think will be one that will be quite hotly debated as to whether it's an attractive feature or one which isn't attractive. But certainly I'll be very, very interested to hear your opinions on this watch, and indeed the quality of its finishing and what you thought. And in terms of a testament to the quality of the brand and the fact that I really do trust them, seeing as I have bought one from them, is that I must say everyone who's reviewed it so far has given very positive thoughts about the quality of this watch, which I must say I agree with, and that's why I was originally curious to see this watch in person, because I found it difficult to believe that a small brand like this could make quality of this nature. But I'm very glad to say I've been very pleasantly surprised. So anyway, I shall turn the lights out and film a Lume shot for you to give you an idea of the different Lume colours of these watches, to show you the way the BGW9 model looks very different to the other versions. Okay, so here are the three watches side by side, with the date version with the blue and gold bezel on the left-hand side, the BGW9 version in the centre, and the golden sand no date on the right-hand side. And as you can see immediately, the Lume colour is very, very different on the BGW9 version. So while the two outer models have the same colour of Lume, though you'll notice on the left-hand side the date version has no Lume plot at 3 o'clock, though I don't feel this really affects legibility, the central watch has that blue BGW9 which glows this vivid light blue, and has the same length of glow as the other two, of about 12 hours. And that's 12 hours after being used in the sunlight, not having been lit up with a torch. And just to make a point of it, I haven't used a UV torch with these watches at all. I've just used them outside for about 15 minutes beforehand in indirect sunlight. So that'll give you a fairly good idea of the way the watches will perform on a daily basis without the added bias and change to the effect of the use of a torch. But certainly the legibility isn't compromised in the case of the blue BGW9 version. I feel that really it puts out the same amount of light for just as long as the other two versions, which certainly is something which I appreciate, because it means there isn't really a concern in terms of length of last that would sway one either way. It really is a matter of opinion. And some studies have shown that green light is more easily perceived by the human eye than the blue light that one may see from BGW9 Lume. But I personally have found them to have very, very similar effects and legibility in the dark, having worn them in both the day and the night to get an idea of how they run. So certainly that shows you what the colours are like, and that tells you about the longevity of Lume last, which I think is important to know really before buying a dive watch of this nature. Anyway, I'll just put these three down and turn the lights back on and conclude the video. Anyway, I will conclude this video here, but I would like to say that I do see that this video was one which has played out rather differently to my normal reviews, because I wouldn't normally make a re-review of models that I've already shown. But I thought it was worthwhile, since the brand decided to send me these watches, to see my opinions on them. So I certainly am pleased that I've been able to see the same quality I saw in the original model in these versions. I've been able to appreciate the quality going into them, just as it did in the original version. And do please leave your comments down below as to your thoughts on these watches, and on the matter of homage watches in general, and especially homage watches to a watch which is really unattainable, like, for instance, homages to vintage Ben Roosses that have been made by brands like Mark II, for instance, that are extremely hard to come by, and so as a result, the homage is really where you have to go to be able to appreciate that aesthetic. So I'd be very interested to hear your opinions, and again, I thank you very much for watching, and please do like, share, and subscribe to help the channel, and to enjoy more content in future on this channel. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.